So I am really excited to introduce to you Tim Welsh, who is the head of office for McKinsey & Company. He is double Harvard College graduate and Harvard MBA. And I will say one of the reasons that I agreed to do the program today is to see Tim, but also because when I was at the Kennedy School, I will admit to a mistake. And sometimes you don't see political people or former political people admit to mistakes. And here's my mistake. Both Samantha Power was teaching that semester, and I did not take her class. And I did not apply to take Michael Porter's class, which is one of the things I deeply regret about my graduate school education is that I did not get to have this firsthand, but I'm so excited to have Tim here today to make our next introduction.
Thanks very much, Margaret, for that very nice introduction. It is a real privilege to be with you today. As you know, Greater MSP is very, very passionate about the clusters in this region and understanding what makes this region terrific. And so we are very excited to be sponsors and supporters of this effort. It is an extraordinary privilege for me to introduce Professor Michael Porter. You all know that he is the Bishop William Lawrence University Professor at Harvard. This is the highest recognition that can be given to any Harvard faculty member. He's the author of 19 books and over 125 articles. 7 of those articles in the Harvard Business Review have been given the McKinsey recognition as the best article of the year in the Harvard Business Review. Fortune magazine comments that Professor Porter has influenced more executives and more nations than any business professor on earth. I'm sure that that is true, and I'm personally grateful for his influence on me. Unlike Margaret, I did have the privilege of being his student when I was at Harvard, and I had the privilege of being his research assistant for a year, and it was his insight about how many of the frameworks from business could be applied in the social sector and for regions as well. And he was a big part of my own personal interest in getting involved in things like the Itasca Project and Greater MSP. So I am personally grateful for his inspiration on this front. So without further ado, I'm very delighted to introduce Professor Michael Porter.
Thank you. That's very generous. Well, Tim, that was embarrassing, but much appreciated, and I'm so pleased to be here today. This, we don't want to be sort of sappy about it, but in a way, today is I'll move out of the way. A critical milestone in what has been about a 25-year journey for me personally, to actually really hopefully start to change at a very deep level the way we think about the economy, about competitiveness, and about economic development. I think many of you have been part of this in your organizations. The greatness of America is people like you that are at the grassroots level doing stuff. And it's a particularly striking time in our history because the people that we pay to do this work of driving the economy forward and setting economic policy, they're completely failing. This is the members of the Senate and the members of Congress and not the EDA. I mean, we got great agencies that are trying, but our political process at the federal level is really not working very well right now. And thank God, we have states, governors, mayors, and local leaders like you, local economic development leaders, and from all the backgrounds that you come from, that really are the great hope that we have now to drive progress in the U.S. But we are at a very, very important moment in this nation's history, economically. I think in general, as much as we've done good, our kind of current model of economic development is not working that well. The American economy is not moving in the right direction. And I think this is a moment where hopefully the work that has been done by so many of you and so many of our team over now a long enough time is finally giving us the rigor, the data, the methods, and the impetus to actually start to turn the tide in the American economy. So let me take a few minutes today and talk a little bit about the kind of the situation I think we're in, why many of the past approaches to economic development have not actually been successful, why I think we need to really understand that this notion of clusters and cluster-based development really is the powerful, powerful lever we have to actually achieve success, and why it's different than the other approaches that so many states and so many regions have taken over the years that have been helpful, and maybe things would have been worse without them, but ultimately we haven't put the American economy on the right track. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge again some of the people in this room that have just been so fundamental to not only this effort, but also to my work over many years. Let me start with Christian Keatles, who you'll hear from later, who is really one of the true leaders in the world at this. And he is behind a massive effort in Europe and also elsewhere in the world in cluster-based development. You know, my colleague Scott Stern, my partner for many, many years in this area, phenomenal impact. Mercedes Delgado, who you heard from, one of my former students, who now is really one of the leading scholars in this field. And then our team at HBS. Harvard Business School has made a profound commitment to this whole body of work. It really started in about 2000, 2001. It was all done internally at the school. We started hacking away at this process of trying to create the first real rigorous data on clusters so that we could actually start to have real benchmarking and rigor in terms of our thinking about how to proceed in regional economies. And the school has been enormously beneficial. And you've met many of the key players, Rich Bryden, who's here somewhere. There he is, the master of the data universe at the Institute at Harvard Business School. Sarah Jane, you've met. Jenny Zhao, who was here up on the screen. Ned Whitman, Jane Wu, Marcella Marino, Manjari Rahman, who leads our U.S. Competitiveness Project, many others. Also, as you all know, there's been an incredible partnership with the Humphrey School and the University of Minnesota, and these incredible folks from Minnesota that you've been hearing from today. We again, when we first started teaching the course at HBS on really economic development and cluster-based economic development, we started partnering with other universities around America and around the world. We have about 125 universities now that partner with us in teaching this curriculum. And the University of Minnesota really was almost like first in line. And we have this incredible relationship with them. And I'm just so pleased that we could actually do this here today, not in Washington, because actually it should be done here, because it's people like the leaders and the faculty from the Humphrey School. It's the Minneapolis-St. Paul region that's been so willing to take responsibility for its own development and own economic future, and that's why it's doing better than most. It's just so apt that we're here amid these friends and in this kind of a location rather than in the dysfunction of Washington. By the way, let me also say that generations, multiple EDA assistant secretaries, including the current leadership of EDA and Matt, who you've already heard from, EDA has been one of the heroes in U.S. economic development, but they've been facing headwinds in terms of the attitudes and the kind of failed, simplistic thinking about development that we still are afflicted with in this country. And so I want to make it clear that although I might say a few more somewhat less complimentary things about Washington before I'm done, I'm not talking about the EDA. We've been partners with the EDA for many, many years, and we're going to be partners for many years to come. And I also want to say that HBS is committed to be the home of this effort for the foreseeable future. And that doesn't mean we want partners, that doesn't mean we don't want help, that doesn't mean we won't work with others, but I think the school is so committed that this is something we can do as an institution to play a part in something that is so profoundly critical really to the trajectory of the future U.S. economy. So let's just kind of set a little bit of the groundwork here. I've already started getting into this topic, but you all know we are very slowly emerging from really a remarkable event that hadn't happened in this country in any of our really lives, which was that deep recession. And people still talk as if that was sort of an aberration. We were cruising along and something weird happened and we had this deep recession and now we're recovering, and the recovery metaphor is still top of mind when you hear people talk about where the U.S. economy is. And every month or every quarter we hope that the job report will be better and the workforce participation numbers will look better. But ultimately I think what all of you know, because you're grassroots people, I think what we all know is that actually well before the recession that hit in 2008, the Great Recession many call it, well before that we were on the wrong path in America. It wasn't the recession. The recession was sort of an extreme event that was triggered by a variety of circumstances, but actually we were on a very disturbing path. And although we are recovering, we're still on the same path. Those fundamental trends that have started to act on our economy, which really started in the 90s and in the early 2000s, in some cases even before, are now still at work. And if we're going to reverse that trend, we have to kind of change our game and step it up in America. The Midwest has got areas that are doing better, areas that are doing a little bit worse, but basically the Midwest is really on the same trajectory as America, except for those relatively small number of areas where the shale gas and oil is found. The shale gas and oil is the number one possible discontinuity that could actually drive growth in the U.S. economy. But even that is not assured because of the ham-handed and inept way that we as a country are responding to that opportunity, and the political battles we're having, and the interest group politics around what is an opportunity actually to have tremendously positive impact on our economy and also on the environment, by the way, if we do it right. But once again, at the federal level, anyway, right now, not only are we on a dangerous path, but we have not been able to actually come together in any sense to actually change the direction of that. We have no strategy as a country. We have made no progress in Washington at any significant economic issue in at least a decade. So you know who's going to have to do it if we're going to change the path of the U.S. economy? You. Us. The mayors, the governors, the private sector, the local economic development officials, the institutions of collaboration. We're going to have to do it. And then maybe someday the folks in Washington will join in. We're going to have to do it. And to have to do it, we're going to have to bring a new game. We have to raise our game. We're going to have to really transform and continue to transform the way we think about economic development. And we believe very, very strongly that the kind of data that you just saw is really the only way we're going to do that. The only way we're going to do that. Now let me just show you some of the data. This is the U.S. economy was a job generation machine for decade after decade after decade. If you smoothed out the ups and downs of little perturbations, you saw that we used to generate in America 2% job growth year after year after year after year after year. Look what happened. This is not a recession. This is something much, much deeper than that. You probably have all heard this, but all the jobs we really created over the last 15 or 20 years, and if we went back another 5 or 10 years, it'd be the same. All the jobs we created were in the local economy, not in the traded economy. We have zero net traded job creation over the last couple decades in the American economy. If we're exposed to international competition, no new jobs. If we are sort of guaranteed the jobs because it's local work, okay, yeah, we can grow jobs there in healthcare and government and construction and areas like that. This all started a long time before 2008. Income has been stagnating. I think we all kind of knew, and if the yellow here is the 80 to 2000, the red is 2000 to 2012. We all kind of knew that the bar was rising, and if you didn't have skill and education, your economic prospects were less robust. And if you look at the yellow bars, that's vividly true. For that period of 1980 to 2000, which was a little bit different than previous generations in America, if you didn't have a high school degree, you were going nowhere. But if you had a college degree or an advanced degree, okay, you're on a decent path. You're going to see improving standard of living. If we play the tape forward to the last 10 or 12 years, what we see is that high school and less than high school, flat, a little bit declining. But look what's happening to even college graduates. The capacity for people, even with a college degree, to actually enjoy improving wage growth has pretty much disappeared. As we know, a lot of people with college degrees are not working in jobs that require a college degree. If you got an advanced degree, you're doing okay still. The U.S. remains a very, very competitive place to do high skill work. Computer science, PhDs, high skill work, we're the place. But for everybody else, what's happened in America is we've not been able to create an environment, a business environment, and a dynamic that has allowed us to provide the benefits of prosperity growth really to the average American. That's the path we're on. And I can go into much more detail, and our U.S. Competitiveness Project at HBS has been dissecting this whole process as deeply as we can, and that we have a whole body of work on this that we'd be happy to share with any of you. But the point I want to make is that this economy is on a very unhealthy path. It's on a path that's creating inequality between the average and the people with a lot of skill and ability and perhaps capital. And that inequality is going to tear us apart if we can't reverse the trend. Because the average American can't do well, the average American is not going to allow the rest of the economy to do well. And we're starting to fight against each other. Who makes too much? Fair. It's being cast as fair or unfair, but it's really all about the fundamental underlying drivers of competitiveness and prosperity that we really haven't been able to address in any systematic way in America for the last 20 or 30 years. We used to be the innovator, first universal public education, first widespread university system accessible to all, interstate highway, best infrastructure. We used to lead in strategies and policies that would really drive us forward in terms of becoming more and more competitive. And now we're not. We're just not getting any of it done. We can't even agree to allow people to get a PhD in America to stay in America. Can't even agree to do that. Despite the fact that we're just dying for advanced skills in this economy. So if anybody is going to do it, we can't wait for the process in Washington. We have to move more aggressively, and our best hope, and I think the place where we're making the most progress is at the state and the regional level. But even there, although there are differences in performance, the general narrative is still holding. The average U.S. per capita real income growth, over the last period of 2001 to 2012 was 0.64%. Some states are doing well, but again, you see the impact of the energy issue, the energy opportunity on the right-hand side of that chart. But the Midwest is pretty much like all other parts of the country. We have some states are doing a little better, some states are doing a little worse, but on average, we're not doing well. and we're not able to support really a very much rising standard of living. So now how have we been approaching economic development over the last, 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years? Well, we would kind of characterize there being kind of four models that we tend to see a lot. And again, I've worked in many states and many regions personally, and our team has as well. And now, of course, we have this wonderful data that we're able to look at. There's kind of the Minneapolis is open for business. I shouldn't say Minneapolis. Let's say Mississippi is open for business. That's kind of model number one. We got to work on all those things, too much regulatory issues in terms of starting businesses, improving the airport. The first sort of most common approach regions take is let's figure out sort of our weaknesses in terms of the business environment, things that companies complain about, and let's see if we can raise the bar. Let's go out and find our peers and see where they're beating us in some way in terms of regulation or in terms of other assets or other infrastructure, and let's sort of fix those problems that are holding back our particular region. And the typical plan here has 72 action items, where the region identifies these 72 areas of weaknesses, and then we say, okay, we're going to go do them. And the problem is that when you have 72 action items, you often have 72 action items, a year later. And it's very hard with this model to actually make much progress. And anyway, even if you do, raising the bar on, simple kind of regulation of business, kind of cost of doing business factors, this is table stakes. This may force you to do less poorly, but it doesn't necessarily lead to much unique success. We see very few regions that have taken that approach actually have made a lot of impact. Then there's the kind of tried and true, at least believed to be tried and true approach of what you might call big game hunting. If we're going to make a real impact on our regional economy, we go out and got to go attract some companies here. So we go out hunting for big companies, we go out hunting for big plants, we take our checkbook, we make huge commitments to incentives, either cash or tax relief or both. And it's zero sum because we're fighting with our neighbors and we're fighting with other states, and we might win some and we lose some. And there's this concept called the winner's curse. If you actually win, that's because you paid too much, because you're the only one dumb enough to bid that high for that plant. And we create a dynamic where the reason businesses want to be in our location is because it's cheap or because we have the biggest tax subsidy, and that kind of attracts the wrong kind of investment and leads to kind of a spiral where we have to do this further and further. And places in the country like the Southeast that have been doing this for many, many years, I think have kind of proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that this doesn't really, they've won a lot of plants, but they really haven't built prosperous economies for their citizens. Then there's another tried and true approach that we see a lot, which is what we call the next big thing. That is, figure out what the latest cool high-tech industry is and build it here. So that for at one point, I think there was like 28 or 29 or 30 biotech initiatives in American states. Every state was going to have a big biotech presence. And of course, we all know what happens when we dream about these new high-tech fields. First of all, we often have very few assets with which we can expect to succeed in those fields. And there's this idea that high-tech means good, but actually a lot of high-tech industries are not necessarily that high wage. And very few regions have the assets to work. And so, but we spend lots and lots of money trying to invest in things and build laboratory space or whatever we're going to do, but yet, ultimately it doesn't happen. And so that's a common approach that hasn't worked in many regions. And then there's kind of the infrastructure, build it and they will come, industrial zones, big infrastructure projects, waterfront developments. There are all kinds of efforts we see all across the country with the idea that we just put a lot of capital in and build a nice kind of downtown river walk. Wow, that's gonna do it. People will come here and that will ignite our economy. But what we know from the facts is net, a lot of people in a lot of states and a lot of regions have been doing all this stuff. But if we look at the trajectory of the U.S. economy, and if we look at the trajectory of the average state, can we possibly conclude that it's working? I don't think so. We don't think so. And I think that we now have to kind of give up on these things. There are little bits of truth in some of these approaches. We do have to be open for business. We do have to fix our weaknesses in terms of business environment. We got to do that. But that's not enough. That's not going to get us to actually changing the trajectory of our economy. Yeah, we want to attract companies to our region, but the question is, which companies do we really want to attract? And what would actually attract them in a way without having to pay 20 times more value in terms of public subsidies? So there's truth in some of these approaches. So I want to dismiss some of these ideas can be powerful, but we've got to have a new kind of holistic view of actually what leads to successful economic development, and I think that's where all of the material we've been talking about today, the tool and so forth, is going to come in. What's the new direction? Well, again, for many of you in this group, this is not so radical. For the average person, it is fairly radical. So the first thing we've got to do is we've got to stop talking about job creation and start talking about building competitiveness. Because if we talk about job creation, if we define success as job creation, first of all, we're going to, what we've ended up with in the last 5 years in terms of job creation is all local, low-wage jobs. Okay? If we just talk about job creation, we're going to keep getting it wrong. We've got to understand it's about building competitiveness. It's about building an environment where we can be highly productive and innovative and drive productivity growth over time. That's step number one. The more we focus on job creation, the more we do stupid things. Because if the job is success, then we can buy that job. We can have some clean energy scheme or a building refurbishment scheme, and we can create some jobs, but that's not going to change the trajectory of our economies. The only way we can change the trajectory is we have to raise the fundamental level of competitiveness. Second theme is we've got to approach economic development from a cluster perspective. Just simply making across-the-board improvements in our business environment in this modern global economy it really doesn't allow us to accelerate growth and generate the kind of employment we want and build new companies. Empirically, we now know this beyond a shadow of a doubt. Number three, when we build an economy in a region, we have to build on our existing and potential strengths. We can't dream about aerospace or biotech. If we have some strengths in those areas, then we can talk about that. But we have to be realistic about where we are, what kinds of businesses and what kinds of technologies and what kinds of skills and what kind of supplier base do we really have, and then we got to go from there. Now that doesn't mean we can't diversify our economy over time. We can't. But we have to do it from the perspective of where we are and what's real, rather than this kind of wishful thinking that we see in so many parts of America. Number four, we need to have a strategy for economic development. Right now we have laundry lists with 72 action items. It's not a strategy. And we'll talk a little bit later about what a regional economic strategy is. And if we had more time, we could talk about what a national economic development strategy would be. Number five, we've got to set priorities and sequence the investments we make and not try to do everything at once. We've got to understand what, at this particular time, is the constraint that will unlock the next chapter and the next chapter after that. I see this particularly in many countries around the world that want to build great research universities when they have a $3,000 GDP per capita. And what they really need to do is build an efficient business environment at this point, and then maybe start to lay the groundwork for the research universities, but that's decades ahead. We've got to be realistic about what's the sequence of things that we need to do to make progress in the near term and lay the groundwork for the long term. And again, that's rarely part of economic development thinking, at least in my experience. And then finally, we've got to be data-driven. We've got to have the facts. We have to know how we're really doing. We can't define our own clusters so we can look good. We can pick the if you get up at midnight, turn left and walk 3 paces, that cluster. No, we got to have a robust, data-driven way of benchmarking ourselves, seeing where we really stand, understanding where the gaps really are, and that is one of the fundamental underlying reason why we have spent the last decade kind of building the groundwork, and recently with the help of the EDA, to put this data in place. Because we really have been flying the airplane blind in many cases in terms of economic development. We've been having wonderful meetings, people come together, they talk about the economy, but they're guessing. And it's idiosyncratic. And it's everybody's opinion. But what we need, frankly, the rigorous, real data if we're going to change this trajectory, because we have a lot of competitors out there in the world now. In the U.S. Competitiveness Project, we found that the U.S. was losing jobs to about 120 other countries. Not just Brazil, not just China, but lots of countries. And you know what? Lots of countries out there are raising their bar. They're improving their regulation. They're improving their intellectual property protection. They're improving their infrastructure. They're doing all this stuff. And if we're going to succeed against that, we have to be very, very rigorous. We have to be very, very realistic about what we think about where we stand and where we need to go. Now, when we talk about competitiveness, again, I think that there's still a widespread misunderstanding of what we mean by competitiveness. And in our U.S. Competitiveness Project at the school, which is now about 3.5 years old, one of the things we found is the most important thing we often have to get across to people is, what do we mean by competitiveness? Lots of different views of competitiveness. Competitiveness, we believe, occurs when 2 things happen. Number one, where the business environment allows businesses operating in that location to meet the test of international competition. And in the case of a state, state competition. Or regional competition. That is intuitive. That's an intuitive definition of competitiveness. But that's only half the definition of competitiveness. The real definition is we got to do that, but at the same time, we also have to create a rising standard of living for the average citizen. If companies compete successfully by laying off workers and cutting wages, we're not competitive. We're not competitive. We can't imagine this today, but if workers are seeing rising incomes and rising wages and companies can't compete, we're not competitive either. You're only competitive where we can create a platform where companies succeed and the average worker can succeed. And those things come together around the notion of productivity. We have to have a highly productive business environment where the individuals in the economy are skilled enough, and all the stuff is there to enable extraordinary productivity that actually earns and supports this high and rising standard of living. In America right now, what's happening is American companies, particularly big companies, are doing pretty well. Record corporate profits. But the average American is not doing well. There's an increasing gap. The high-skilled Americans are doing great. The medium and lower skilled Americans are doing poorly. How could this happen? Well, it happens because businesses, of course, if they find a high-cost business environment, or if they can't find the skills they need, what do? They invest abroad. They can do really well, even if America has weaknesses. High-skilled people in America take advantage of America's greatest strength, our entrepreneurial capacity, our great universities. But the average American is exposed to America's greatest weaknesses, which today are high regulatory costs, high corporate taxes, high cost of health care, a whole litany of things. And what we're not doing in America is we're not really creating jobs for those middle-skilled people anymore. And that's ultimately the underlying cause of the inequality in the economy. We've got to see that in order to truly be competitive, we got to change the game so that we can have companies succeeding while America is succeeding as a location for business and a location for middle-skill jobs, not just jobs for PhDs and computer science professionals. We used to be that place. We used to have the most productive business environment in the world in the U.S., but we don't today, for a whole variety of reasons that you all are very familiar with, and we can talk about later if you're interested. Now, what's the relevant unit of analysis when we think about economic development and build an economic strategy? Well, clearly nations remain important because many policies are set at the national level. Corporate tax policy, for example, is the single most important thing that would ignite the growth of our economy. And that's a federal issue. There's a little bit of corporate tax at the state level, but the big kahuna is the federal policy towards corporate tax. So some critical policies that affect competitiveness are set at the federal level. And by and large, that's where we're kind of dead in the water in America right now. Anything at the federal level, immigration, corporate tax, infrastructure, international trading system, we're dead in the water on all those federal level things. And that's part of the problem that we're all struggling with, you and we, as we sympathize with you, having to take action at your level. States are also important to some extent in competitiveness because states, again, set policies that affect all the entities in their state. And some areas of regulation, some on smaller but relevant areas of taxation, some areas of infrastructure, states play a role as well. A lot of the big bucks come from the federal government, but states play a role as well. So states are important too. But we all know that states are actually even too big in many cases because many of the real levers that drive competitiveness are below the state level. They're at the regional level. We know that a given state often has multiple regions. And that we have to understand that those regions are different. Minneapolis-St. Paul is different than, other parts of Minnesota. And when we think about economic development, we got to think mostly at the regional level. The region is the core unit of economic development. We also know that regions cross state boundaries. So this region of Minneapolis-St. Paul, actually part of it's in Wisconsin. And that's relevant because a lot of the businesses that make up this economy are across that border. That happens a lot in America. So again, part of kind of the process we have to go through in this country is to get more and more of the focus down at the regional level. I say down because it's smaller. If you scroll down, it's smaller. But actually the region is a core prime unit of analysis, and that's why we needed to do this level of granularity of data. Because in order to understand how all of that works and how the various regions in the state interact and how a state connects with other states in terms of what it's doing, you have to get down into the detail of how even counties and economic areas really work and what's going on there. Now, in terms of the drivers of competitiveness, I think we have had a huge body of learning now over the last 15 or 20 years about the underpinnings of competitiveness. We know that competitiveness starts with endowments, things that you inherit, your geography, your location in the world, in the United States, your population that you end up with that's here, people that are here. Every region has an endowment of some kind. Detroit happens to be sitting on the river across from Canada. One of Detroit's biggest opportunities has to do with that endowment, that it happens to be there and it happens to be the gateway to Canada, and tons of stuff moves through Detroit. That's an example of of an endowment, the physical location and proximity of Detroit to the major industrial centers in Canada. Okay? What we know is that just the endowment, whether you have good weather or good agricultural conditions or you're located next to Canada, the endowment will only take you so far. It will create some wealth. It will create some possibilities for income. But what we've learned is you have to build on top of that endowment more stuff. And the kind of next layer of competitiveness we like to talk about is macroeconomic competitiveness. This has to do with the kind of basic monetary and fiscal stability of the location. So we're dependent on the monetary and fiscal stability of America because that affects every region, and the monetary and fiscal stability of the state because that affects every region within the state. But we're also, have to worry about the monetary and fiscal stability of the county or the city or whatever other unit we're looking at. Because if we have rampant inflation, or we keep missing our budget, or we have to keep raising taxes, that creates a very bad platform on which to develop your endowments and build a competitive economy. We also know that we need effective political institutions. We need to have good basic education, good basic health care. All those things are really important, we find from the research, on creating a possibility for competitiveness. So good endowments are a foundation, but really we need to build on those endowments to make them valuable. The endowments themselves don't get us much. It's what we do with the endowments. If you go back to Detroit, Detroit has this ridiculous bridge that crosses between Detroit and Canada, and massive, huge amounts of commerce go on that bridge. They haven't been able to build a new bridge. And so they're giving up massive opportunity economically. So yeah, we can be located in the right place, but unless we put in place the right infrastructure and the right foundation to take advantage of that location, the location, it's not going to give us the value that we hope. But the real key to prosperity is taking whatever endowment you have, putting in place a stable platform of institutions and macroeconomic and fiscal stability and all that kind of stuff, but then building the microeconomic competitiveness on top of that. And that has to do with these three big things that are the fundamental agendas of all real serious economic development. Is number one, it's the companies. We can't have a competitive economy unless we have competitive companies. We have to raise the bar in our companies. A lot of you do those things. We try to get training. We try to improve the quality of business education and management education. We diffuse quality programs. We do all kinds of things to raise the bar in companies. So that's clearly a critical part of economic development. We know that the business environment is key. Unless we have an efficient business environment in which to do business, the companies are not going to be able to be productive here. They're not going to find the right skills. They're not going to find the right infrastructure. And therefore, they will not be as successful. They won't create as many jobs, and they won't come here in the first place. Again, lots of you do lots of work on the business environment, and over the last decades or so, we've got increasingly granular understanding of the business environment and how to benchmark that business environment, assess how we're doing on every aspect of that business environment. And the business environment, I think, has become table stakes. It's no longer where you win. It's where you lose if you don't have these basic conditions in the business environment. That's not to say we shouldn't be doing them. It makes them very urgent, but we have to do. But we can't just stop here. We have to do this, but it's not enough. And then, of course, that leaves us with that thing in between. There's an individual company perspective, and we know individual companies are important. And we know companies can be better run or more poorly run, And we need to raise the bar in those companies. We all understand that. We know the business environment is important. We know we have to have a good general business environment. We know companies all rely on certain general things that cut across the entire economy. We know those things are important. But ultimately, what we've found now over the last several decades is actually the real action comes sort of in the middle. It's where clusters of companies come together with unique aspects of the business environment. And of course, that's what clusters are all about. That's what clusters are all about. Now, so we're absolutely clear about this, when we think about an economy and we think about clusters, we have to understand that there's really two major parts of an economy. There's the local economy, and that serves the local needs. And the reason we're able to create local jobs is because the local clusters don't have to compete with other locations. If you've got 10 million people living in a place, you're going to have some roughly average number of restaurants. You're going to have some roughly average number of hospitals. You get those things just by being there, just because the people are there. The local economy is about the local market. Now, part of the local market is business. Part of the local market is business needs of businesses located in that region. We'll come back to that in a minute. The other part of the economy of any region is the traded economy. Those are the businesses where actually we're trading with other states and we're trading with other countries. There, the markets we can serve are unlimited in the traded economy. If we develop a unique product or a unique service in the traded economy, our market is unlimited. It's not limited by the size of Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's global. And in theory, we can become Apple. We can become the world's most valuable company, although it may have lost that title recently. So the wonderful thing about the traded economy is we can grow way beyond the size of the local market for a particular product if we can be good enough to be competitive in that part of the economy. Now, when we have a traded economy, that also creates some of the demand in the local economy because the businesses there are going to demand certain things, need certain things. So these two things are connected. But I think what you all know is the traded economy is the dog, and the local economy is the tail. Okay? The traded economy has the high wages. The traded economy has the high innovation. The local economy is important. It creates lots of jobs. It has the majority of jobs. 2/3 of all the jobs in any region are in the local economy. But actually, the dog that's kind of driving that particular tail is the traded economy. There's much lower wages in local clusters, and there's much lower levels of innovation and all the other metrics we look at. So when we think about economic development, we've got to make sure that we don't get in the way of the traded economy. We've got to take it seriously. We've got to do things we can to make it better and more efficient and so forth. But ultimately, we've got to rivet our attention on the traded economy, because that's ultimately what is going to provide the long-term vitality and opportunity to grow. And it's the traded economy where these clusters come in. This is actually life sciences in Massachusetts. This is something we've been working on in Massachusetts for the last 20 years. It is the single greatest concentration of technology and startups and firms in this field on the face of the earth. It's driving our economy now at a very high rate. It's actually become a cluster of clusters. So we have biopharma, and we have analytical instruments, and we have medical devices, and we have other associated fields. All have come together in the Boston metropolitan area. That's a cluster. A cluster is an agglomeration. It's a critical mass where you get a whole set of companies and suppliers and supporting industries all together in a particular location, facilitated by what we call institutions for collaboration. That notion has been mentioned a couple times today already. I just want to make sure you all know what that means. Institution for collaboration is something that's it's not government. It's not a university, not per se a university. It's all those organizations in between, trade associations, cluster organizations, manufacturing accelerators. And there's thousands and thousands of these organizations. In Massachusetts Life Sciences, we have probably hundreds of them. And these institutions are the glue that connects and holds all of this together and facilitates all the flow and exchange and market activity. And we've come to find that having enough density of these organizations is critical for success in building an economy and building clusters. And that's one of the reasons why, for the first time, we want on this site to start collecting a rigorous data set of all of these organizations in America. Because they're playing such a profoundly important role in the economy, yet it's been invisible. There's no books about this. There's no theory about this. It's all hidden. And yet it's critical to economic success. And some of you are part of these and have built these and created these. And so you're the heroes. But this has not really become part of our common understanding of what it takes to be economically successful. in this modern global economy of ours. With our data set, we can, of course, look at any region and piece apart, what are those areas where there are critical mass in terms of clusters. And all kinds of data about how they're doing. And within each of the clusters, where are we strong within the cluster? Where are the gaps? Are we weak on the machinery side? Are we weak on the services side? Are we weak on this segment of the market? And so on. So that you've heard a lot about that this morning. But what we now have for the first time is we actually now have, we now have the roadmap that allows us to kind of find our way through, where this region is actually competing, where it's winning, where it's growing, where it's sprouting new businesses, where it's sprouting technology, and where's it not, to inform our thinking about how to compete. You heard this morning, I think, a little bit about now, this is no longer a guess. This is no longer speculation, what I've just said. Now that we finally have the real data on the detailed composition of regional economies over decades, we now know that if you have strong clusters, your regional economy does better. We now know that if you have breadth of industries within a cluster, your cluster does better and your regional economy does better. We know this affects job growth. Jobs are not randomly created in an economy. Jobs tend to disproportionately rise out of areas where you're starting to build a critical mass and you actually have a cluster. If you have a strong cluster, the wages are higher than other regions that have the same cluster that are not as strong. If you have a strong cluster, that's where the innovation and patenting comes from. If you have a strong cluster, that's where new business formation starts and accelerates. That's where businesses survive longer and do better if they emerge out of a critical mass, out of a cluster. And you heard earlier about the new work on resilience. There's been I remember decades ago people used to say, well, we don't want to build up this really strong cluster in this region. What if we have a downturn? We'll get hammered by that. And it turns out that in a downturn, you get hammered. But what we find is that if you have strength and if you have a real competitive advantage because you've got a strong cluster, then, boy, you come screaming back. And you probably get hurt a little bit less in the downturn in the first place. Compared to other economies. So there's now increasing evidence, empirical evidence. It's just pouring out now that if we really want to understand what affects what really matters to us, job growth, wage growth, innovation growth, new business formation, it's not an open thing across the entire economy. That's not the way it works. It has to do with where you have some existing strength. And we've also learned that if you want to build new strength, you've got to build on your existing strength. You can't just dream about some future that's disconnected with the present and what you have today. And this chart is actually reflects our, it's not totally updated to the new cluster definitions because that turns out to be really hard. We'll get to it within weeks. But this slide still uses some of the old definitions for those of you that are astute enough to see that. But you can see that these clusters are related. So it turns out that if you're in petrochemicals, your odds of success in diversifying your economy are dramatically higher. Let's find petrochemicals down here. See oil and gas? If you're going to try to diversify your economy and you're in oil and gas, you have a high odds of doing that successfully into chemicals or plastics. That's what this shows. But almost zero odds of doing it into textiles or production technology or heavy machinery. What this says is that economies grow by building on strength and moving into related fields. So if you really want to grow your economy and diversify it, you have to start with a deep understanding of where you are today, where you have some critical mass, where you have some assets to build on, and then you have to find those areas that are related. And we've now been able to prove this. We can look how economies do diversify over decades now that we have this rich data. And we find that your odds of success of just dreaming up a whole new industry, disconnected to anything you have now, and trying to make it happen are close to zero. But your odds of moving along these intersections are reasonably high. And so again, we have much more insight into how to avoid wasting resources. And so many regions spend so much money on so many programs and so much infrastructure in economic development. But ultimately, I think we're starting to understand that the reason that hasn't worked so well is that's actually not the way the economy actually functions, and that's not the way that a competitive advantage actually gets created. So we're finding that, if you really want to have a strong regional economy, then that's made even greater if you have strengths in related clusters. If you can put two related clusters together, you do even better than having either cluster separately in terms of all those metrics, jobs, wages, and so forth. We also find that your neighbor and the clusters in your neighboring region can help you succeed in your region. So one of the great opportunities to find, even if you don't have a cluster in your region, if you look at your immediate neighbors and find out where they're strong, that's an axis for success. And again, the data is quite compelling on that. And it makes perfect sense because most regions are not, the America, they're 2 hours from each other. So maybe you've got a really strong cluster in the metropolitan area, but going out into the rural areas, your best opportunity for success in a rural area is to hook into that cluster in the nearby metropolitan area, and make simpler products or components or something that allows you to connect to that neighbor. Okay, so it's this kind of thinking that actually leads to successful economic development. And if you look at the success stories, people often didn't have this written down, but intuitively this is what people were thinking. They didn't have really the data to back it up. This is what they were thinking, and this is the way it actually happened. And now we have, hopefully, a tool and data and rigor that allows us to actually be much more careful and thoughtful and successful at this kind of activity. That's what this tool is fundamentally all about. Last key piece, though, I want to mention very strongly when we do this kind of work is we need a strategy. Implicitly, so much of economic development is the thing on the left. Let's get better in every single policy area. Let's implement best practices in each area of the business environment, in each area of policy. And as I've said before, there's a huge number of areas, every region has a huge number of areas to improve. And that includes Boston, where I'm deeply involved. As good as we are, we have many areas to improve. We could spend all of our time incrementally improving each policy area, and we would be busy for the next 50 years. But that doesn't work. You can't make progress in every policy area. A strategy is where you really have an overall agenda, where you step back and you understand what is this economy now, what does it look like, where are we strong, and then how could we build sort of a more holistic view of where we could play, where we can win, where we have the potential to be successful because of the realistic assessment of where we are today and what we could get done in some reasonable period of time. We like to talk about regional strategy as starting with kind of a value proposition. What's the value proposition of this region? Why would anybody ever want to do business here in our region? What do we bring? What are our assets? Given where we are, given who our neighbors are, given our existing clusters, given our emerging clusters, given a realistic assessment of our business environment, who could we be? Why would anybody want to do business here? So much economic development isn't about this. So much economic development is about little projects to improve the road to the airport. But ultimately, we've got to put all those projects in a broader perspective, a broader kind of strategic perspective of the trajectory of what this economy could become. We did that in Massachusetts starting about 20 years ago. And we finally decided in Massachusetts we were not going to be the low-cost state. We were just not going to do it. We didn't want to be. We wanted to be a high-wage state. That our real opportunity, our only real opportunity, was to build on our most unique strength, which was our scientific and technical and university capacity. Okay? And that led to a transformation in our economic development strategy. We stopped bidding for plants. We stopped trying to attract plants unless they fit within our clusters. And over a 20-year period, Massachusetts went from Taxachusetts, oh, look at those idiots in Massachusetts, they're crazy, they're socialist, to an amazingly successful economy. And that's because it was strategic. And it was really Governor Bill Weld, that was the first of our governors that was actually able to take that mantle. And Governor Patrick has just carried the torch. You want to read a great state economic development strategy? Read the one from Massachusetts. It's a textbook of how to think about this issue of economic development strategically and holistically with really a cluster sensibility. This is the way we've got to approach this problem going forward. But in order to do that, we need, first of all, to put clusters at the center of this tool, because the cluster framework gives us leverage. It allows us to kind of understand how to take advantage of these spillovers and linkages and connections and relatedness to really drive innovation and drive entrepreneurship and drive and pull new businesses into our economy. Clusters gives us a way to bring all the players together in a strategic way around driving the economy. It gives us a way to make our traditional economic development much more effective. We should never be out attracting businesses unless we're attracting them for some clusters where we have some strength. We'll get dramatically high success rates in attracting businesses if we got a cluster to talk about than if we're just saying, oh, come here, we're nice folks. It's efficient here. We have a low tax rate. If all your marketing is your low tax rate and we're nice, you're going to get companies that are right on the edge in terms of they won't exist without that low tax, and they'll leave as soon as it goes up. We know that. If you're going to do workforce development, you got to connect it to something. You got to connect it to the areas where you have strength and potential growth opportunities. So clusters not only gives us a way to think about how to work between public and private sector to kind of build the economy, but it also allows us to organize our public policy in a much more efficient way. In America, we waste gobs of money on public economic development, not because it isn't important, but because we just waste it. We train people for jobs that don't exist because we're not connecting training to the nature of our particular economy. We do the wrong stuff. We invest in the wrong things. Because we're not informed by this granular view of how the economy actually works and how business really gets created and where accelerated growth takes place. And again, that's why we've been on this journey for so long, but finally, with a lot of help from a lot of you and the EDA, we now finally have, I think, the opportunity to do this in a rigorous, systematic, data-driven way, and that's what this tool is all about. So I just want to say one more time, thank you to so many people in this room who have been critical to this effort. Both the whole cluster development, cluster thinking effort, which has now actually even gotten to Washington. I thought it would never happen. But there are multiple now cluster-based programs that are popping up inside of Washington. But so many states and so many regions and so many of you have been already on this path. It's taken us a while, but some phenomenal people have allowed this to happen. HBS, I just am so grateful to have had the privilege of being there. What institution? That institution has supported this work inside HBS for the last decade. And, just because they thought it was important. And so we thank HBS. But then EDA, of course, was the one who came to us and said, okay, guys, we think this is pretty interesting. Now let's get serious. and really do it. And really do it right. And make it open and transparent and engage practitioners all across the country. And so today, for us, it's just an incredibly exhilarating moment. We're happy you're here. We want every one of you to go home and log on to this site and start working, okay? We want you to post every economic development organization in your region on this site. We want every cluster group on this site. We want every initiative, because the more we can get the right data, the more we can have the right insight into what our economy is and what's going on and what's not going on, the more we can exchange ideas with folks in other regions that are doing some similar things, and we can learn from them. The faster we can do that, the more progress we'll all make. The more we'll take our scarce resources, our limited budgets, and really get the most leverage out of them. And we are committed to be on this journey with you. If we need feedback, negative feedback, give it to us. Because again, this is not about theory. This is not an academic enterprise. The academic part is on, as Scott mentioned this morning, we're academics and we're going to write papers, and we're going to discover new things, hopefully, and it's going to be useful. But this enterprise is about practice. It's about changing what happens in practice, informing it better. And let me just end by making one more point that I think all of you need to understand. I hope you need to understand. I think you need to understand it. And that is, I'm a strategy professor at the core, and my initial work was on company strategy. And, I developed this framework about, competitive strategy and industry structure and positioning and all that kind of stuff. And I got a question over and over again that I'd like to share with you, and that is, what if everybody understands these concepts? Doesn't that mean that no one can win? Okay? And the idea was, well, if everybody understands the same strategy ideas, then how can anybody get a competitive advantage? And you might be thinking the same thing. Well, if we have all these new concepts of economic development, all these new tools, well, everybody has them, so how are we going to win? And the answer is actually the same in economic development as it is in company strategy. The essence of this way of thinking about economic development is that it says that success comes from being different, not copying what any other region is doing. There's no one model for how to develop a regional economy. And the reason that this is so powerful is that we can create a different kind of competition among regions. Not a destructive zero-sum game, which is what bidding for plants is, for example, and chasing the hot industry. But a game where each of us develops even more uniqueness, even more distinctiveness, and even more unique combination of assets and skills in related industries and clusters. So ultimately, I believe that this tool will allow us actually to transform a lot of what has been really destructive competition across regions into a much more strategic competition that will have the result of really raising the bar across the entire American economy. The real secret weapon of the American economy historically has been our specialization. It's been that, each state and each region historically has taken more responsibility for trying to drive things forward, and that's happened without a lot of theory. That's happened by each region sort of developing its own different specialization. Unlike UK, for example, or other countries where it's all top-down from Paris or London telling everybody what to do. I think we can take that specialization and that developing unique regional strategies to a whole new level now that we are informed by this data and these tools. So again, a huge thank you to all of you for being here, for being part of this day for us, and I'll look forward to, we'll be looking forward to working with you for many years to come. So thank you for being here, and we'll do it.